I'm Al Hunt.
And I'm Mark Halpern. And with all due respect to Newt Gingrich, putting you on the ticket with Donald Trump was always kind of a moonshot. And with all due respect to Chris Christie, putting you on the ticket with Donald Trump was always a bridge too far. Al and I were here all week. Welcome to a very special Veep Stakes edition of With All Due Respect. John Heilman spent the day in Northern Virginia covering Hillary Clinton's big event with the man said by many to be her top running mate contender, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. But it's the Republican Veep Stakes speculation that has reached critical mass today. A whole lot of signs point to Indiana Governor Mike Pence as Donald Trump's choice to be unveiled tomorrow at a Gotham City press conference where Trump is expected to announce his decision. There are a lot of news outlets, including CBS News, reporting Pence is the choice for Trump. Some are saying it's all but certain that that's who Trump will choose. Trump officials, though, telling Bloomberg that no final decision at this hour has been made. However, a local Indiana reporter named Jim Shella, who's a respected veteran journalist there, tweeted late this afternoon, confirmed Mike Pence departed Mount Comfort Airport at 4:10, headed to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Video is going to be on the air at this hour. Al, let's assume that Trump picks the Hoosier state governor. Is Pence a good choice?
It's a safe choice, Mark. I mean, I think it's not going to do any harm, and that's really important. A Newt Gingrich or a Chris Christie would have been a more exciting and more explosive choice, but they could have really, really cratered. Mike Pence is steady. He's reliable. He's not going to embarrass the candidate. Helps a little bit with the social right, who's suspicious of Trump, but won't excite a whole lot of voters.
Helps with the social right. Helps with some members of Congress where he served.
Yeah.
I think helps with some of the big donors, including the Koch brothers. The thing that's a risk about Pence is, the one time of late where he was in the national spotlight, he didn't do well.
He choked.
He choked, and he is better than that. He is a very steady guy, personally, very steady politically. But I think the good thing about Pence is, if Trump's going to win this race, he's going to make the story Hillary Clinton. And if he'd chosen either Gingrich or Christie, it wouldn't have been about Hillary those a lot of days. I think Pence will have a good week. I think he'll be prepared. He's got good people around him. He'll be good tomorrow if he's the choice. He'll be good at the convention and his speech. He'll be good in his media interviews. And then I think, except for the debate, he'll largely disappear. And I think that's primarily why he was picked, in order to put the focus on Trump and Clinton, which is where Trump wants it.
Right, I agree. Can you imagine either Newt Gingrich or Chris Christie trying to make the case against Hillary Clinton on either the personal transgressions of Bill Clinton or ethics? I mean, it would have been laughable and it would have been counterproductive.
And Pence is clean on personal stuff.
And there won't be a whole lot of attention to pay to what he says. Vice presidents, we get all excited. I count myself. Yeah. Do they carry this? Do they carry that? Do they help with that? You got to go back to LBJ to find one that really made a big difference. And Mike Pence is, in that sense, a very safe choice.
The other good thing I think about Pence is he is a steady influence. He's a policy guy. He's opposite of Trump in a lot of ways, and that will reassure people. I've been asking Paul Manafort and others for weeks, will Trump pick someone who people say that guy's qualified to be president? They've said absolutely, and I think Pence clears that bar, just as Al Gore did, just as Dick Cheney did, just as Joe Biden did. He's experienced in Congress. He also has some positions on some votes that he's taken that I think people haven't focused on a lot that are like Trump. He voted against the prescription drug bill. He voted against the bailout for the financial industry. I think he's got some sort of anti-government, big government votes that will fit in nicely with the Trump coalition.
Well, he'll probably have to adjust on things like his pro-free trade position. Yeah. He is good. He is not nearly as heavy as his predecessor, Mitch Daniels. No. This is not a heavyweight in the same vein as Cheney or Biden, but it is a perfectly acceptable choice.
Very solid guy. All right, Mike Pence, besides being the governor of Indiana, has been around politics for decades. He's a former congressman and a radio host. He's a social conservative. And as I said, he's cast some populist economic votes in favor of smaller government. So, Al, the opposition research team at the DNC, the Clinton headquarters, they're geared up. They've been preparing. And sites along with the others. Where will they go after Pence?
Well, the first thing I saw today, which I thought, Oppo research of Mike Pence.
Right.
It was from the Hillary campaign, and what it said was he's going to be in real trouble because he's joined Donald Trump,
right.
which told me that they had a whole huge litany on Newt Gingrich and Chris Christie, and they couldn't use it. I don't think there'll be a lot. It'll be, some of his socially conservative views. He'll be depicted as anti-gay. As you say, he got in great trouble with that so-called religious liberty issue out there. Sometimes he hasn't been the best politician in the world. He ran against John Boehner, for GOP leader one time and just got clobbered. So there'll be some of that, but nothing that'll really cut.
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree there won't be anything that cuts. They'll say he's too conservative on social issues. I think they'll highlight the areas where they disagree, although I don't think they'll do trade very hard because the Clintons waffling on trade. The thing that I think that he's vulnerable on to some extent is his position in Indiana. His popularity has gone down. He was in danger, if he does get out of the governor's race, in danger of losing, if he doesn't get out, he's in danger of losing his seat to a Democrat in a Republican state. So I think they'll point to the fact that he's not governed in a way that's increased his popularity. But I think after next week, except for the debate, there's not going to be a lot of discussion of Mike Pence in this conference.
I saw Joe Donnelly, the senator, the Democratic senator from Indiana, who's a pretty able politician, about 10 days ago, and he said, I really think Democrats are going to win the governor's race in Indiana. I don't think he's blowing smoke. I think he really thought that.
Here's the thing about Pence is, even though he's got hardline positions, a lot of Democrats like him. He
doesn't come across as a mean guy.
He has good relationships, and in this polarized age, he's got a pretty good relationship with Democrats. And so I think you're going to have a hard time getting a lot of Democrats to go out and trash him, Democratic members of Congress, including from Indiana. That's my sense from talking to Democrats about him. And Republicans, I think, recognize that people will rally around him. This is not going to be a guy who, if he's attacked, won't have defenders. He has good relationships with a lot of House members from his time there. And so even if Democrats do come after him, I don't think he's going to be a Dan Quayle, deer in the headlights on anything, whatever it is they throw at him.
I think he also makes it more likely, I'm guessing, that she chooses a Tim Kaine or a Tom Vilsack rather than Elizabeth Warren.
Safe versus safe.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. The two other finalists that Donald Trump was considering, and we believe is now eliminated, were Chris Christie and Newt Gingrich. Christie sat down with Nicole Wallace for an MSNBC discussion today. Also, Gingrich logged on to one of his live Facebook Q&As this afternoon.
I told him quite directly that I thought that he had a choice between having two pirates on the ticket or having a pirate and a relatively stable, more normal person.
Some of your supporters feel like this is owed to you, that no one has taken more lumps for backing him when they did than you. Do you feel that way?
No. No one's owed the vice presidency of the United States. The guy who wins gets to pick who's going to do it. And so I'm not owed anything in that regard at all, and I don't view it that way. And I think if you do view it that way, then you don't have your eye on the ball. The eye on the ball is win the race first, and then be the person who can help the president be the best president he can be.
So both those guys seem to be taking it okay. For Christie, though, there was some exquisitely bad news today. The timing couldn't have been worse. David Sampson, who is a longtime close associate of Christie, pled guilty to a felony conspiracy charge that he used his position as the head of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey to set up a nonstop United Airlines flight from Newark International Airport to an airport in South Carolina that happens to be near Sampson's vacation home. Sampson was chairman of the Port Authority when Christie allies caused traffic gridlock on the George Washington Bridge in 2013, a.k.a. Bridgegate. So, Al, we both know that that Christie and Gingrich have lots of baggage.
More than United Airlines.
Yeah, more than United, even in Denver. Why? If it is Pence, why do you think Trump went that way? What was wrong with the two other guys?
I think at some point he saw. My guess is he was inclined to go for one of those because they really are great attack dogs.
And kindred spirits.
Right, but he saw just the real downside in that. I mean, Newt Gingrich, I'm glad he finally confessed that he wasn't normal. I first had lunch with Newt Gingrich, Mark, I'm not sure you were born, July of 1974, when he told me the party had to get away from Ronald Reagan. So, I mean, Newt's got such a history.
Pre-pirate phase.
Oh, honest to God. And Christie, I mean, we're going to talk later about this plea today, but, I mean, Bridgegate has not gone away.
Yeah. I think that left to his own devices, Trump would have picked one of those two. But that getting advice, and we'll talk to Kelly O'Donnell later in the program about this, he was getting advice from some people who were favorable towards those two. But the main advice was that those guys were just too volatile personally, too volatile in terms of their backgrounds. Right. And I think that, like I said before, you're not going to put Newt Gingrich or Chris Christie on the national stage for several months and not have days where they create the story.
Right.
Where they're the story, and not this,
Right.
not in a way that's advantageous to Trump. So picking them seemed to me to be too big a risk, but their upsides are great. Is Mike Pence going to help Trump get elected except by being safe? Probably not.
He
very
won't,
much.
Mark, but neither would Christie or Gingrich.
Yeah.
Vice presidents, I just think don't do that. And imagine Chris Christie going after Hillary Clinton on ethics. I mean, well, wait a second. I mean, what's Bridgegate? It's still out there.
Yeah.
Or imagine Newt Gingrich trying to attack her on the personal behavior of her husband.
Yeah, he tried that once before.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah. All right. Up next, all the water that has not flowed under the bridge for Chris Christie. We're going to talk more about this David Sampson guilty plea and about Christie's relationships within the Trump campaign after these words from our sponsors.
We called in a pro to shed more light on today's guilty plea by former New Jersey Port Authority Chairman David Sampson and the political implications for Governor Chris Christie. MSNBC political correspondent and Garden State native Steve is with us. Steve, I know Sampson's lawyer, Mike Chertoff. He's a smart lawyer. This all sounds like some kind of a deal because Sampson was going to deliver more goods to the prosecutor. Is that an unfair implication?
Well, there's a question now of whether he maybe did deliver something, because the surprise that nobody saw coming today necessarily was Sampson put his guilty plea in, and that story broke. And then about an hour later, prosecutors charged Jamie Foxx, and he's another veteran of New Jersey politics. He'd been the Secretary of Transportation under Christie. He'd previously been a Secretary of Transportation in the state under a Democratic governor. This is somebody very well known in Trenton. Charged him with conspiracy to commit bribery, basically saying he's part of the scheme with Sampson. Now, Foxx is fighting the charges. He's going to court to contest it. Sampson obviously not going to be doing that. So there's more of an open question right now about what David Sampson's role is going to be going forward. There were initial reports. There were 2 reports today that David Sampson wasn't going to be cooperating. And, of course, if that is true, that's great news for Chris Christie in terms of people looking at Sampson and saying he would be a threat to Chris Christie because potentially he could give up something. He'd have to give up somebody bigger than himself. Very, very few people in the political world in New Jersey bigger than David Sampson, so presumably that would be Chris Christie. But that may have answered the question with what we saw with Jamie Foxx earlier.
So, Steve, this Sampson plea comes out of Bridgegate as they start to overturn, look under rocks at the Port Authority. There's still pending other things there, pending trials for the two main defendants in the Bridgegate proper. Is it your sense that whether it's smoke, fire, or some combination, that the Trump vetters would have looked at this stuff and said it's just too risky to pick someone who at any moment could be implicated?
I mean, the bottom line, what we know is right now the trials are scheduled to go forward this fall. Now, they've been delayed a number of times, but if they go on schedule, then they're playing out during the presidential campaign. And the odds are, even if he's not directly implicated, Chris Christie's name is going to be coming up in those trials an awful lot. So that's going to be hanging over the campaign. The other thing in this is the principals here, the two people who are going to be standing trial this fall. You've also got David Wildstein, who cut the deal with prosecutors over a year ago now. I get the sense that all of them, or at least some of them, are just waiting for all of the legal drama to end here to be able to come out and say publicly what has been on their mind about Chris Christie for the last few years. So at any minute, if you're Chris Christie, you also have that prospect if you're running for national office, these people coming out and saying very pointed things about you potentially.
Steve, you know how they play politics in Jersey. It's tough. If whoever did this ridiculous Bridgegate thing, it's just human nature suggests you'd want to tell the boss, hey, guess what we did? Why would you do it and not brag about it internally?
Well, that's the question too. Is I mean, there's obviously the basic practical question of did Christie know? Can you ever find some kind of document, some kind of smoking gun proof that Christie knew? That's never turned up. For all we know, that never will turn up. But I think the thing that Christie's critics latch onto here is the idea of, you hear the term, the culture of the administration. Did Christie create a culture in his administration that basically told everybody that driving up the margin in the 2013 re-election as a way of sort of being a springboard into the 2016 presidential campaign, that driving up that margin at any and all costs was the most important thing they could do, and anything they could do to squeeze a few extra votes to make that margin that much higher, that much more impressive to national political observers, they should do? Did something like this, going after a local mayor who refused to endorse, did it grow out of a culture that said that?
Well, nobody knows more about that political culture than you, Steve Kornacki. Thank you for joining us. And when we come back, the Republican Rules Committee gets off to a messy start today here in Cleveland. We'll talk about that, Veep stakes, and more right after this.
update for you on Donald Trump's Veep Stakes search. Jonathan Karl of ABC News reporting now that Donald Trump has asked Mike Pence to be his running mate. That announcement expected formally tomorrow in New York City. We'll talk more about that later in the show. But let's get to the business that's taking place here in Cleveland. The first day today of the Republican Rules Committee started out meeting this morning ahead of the convention, and things got off to a bit of a rocky start. RNC officials and the anti-Trump leaders on the Rules Committee, who are trying to figure out a way to unbind delegates so they can vote however they wish, huddled behind closed doors, postponing most of the activity today. They've only just come back in after a long delay. They blamed it out on a faulty copier. I'm not really sure why they're using a copier, but obviously, and we've heard about this for several days, that the RNC Rights Priebus has been concerned. They don't want disruption on the floor. They don't believe they're in danger of losing Trump control of the floor and Trump losing a vote in terms of unbinding the delegates, but they don't want a minority report that doesn't require very many votes. So is this a small problem for the RNC or potentially something that could distract from into next week?
I think it's probably a small problem. I think on both the platform and rules, you got it right. They don't want any kind of messy floor fight. There's a lot of frustrated delegates out here who really aren't with Trump, but there's a limit as to what they can do. I think that between Priebus, the RNC, and Trump, and they are together, they're marching lockstep on this, I think they probably will be able to control the outcome.
Yeah, there's a couple things I think that are cross-cutting here that we'll have to see. One is Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, who's on the committee, he and his wife's on the committee as well. They have been silent about where they stand on these issues of binding. He was a big supporter of Ted Cruz. He's not been a big fan of Trump. Until we see what Mike Lee's doing, I think can't be exactly sure.
And his chief of staff was the top guy on the platform committee who also gave him some trouble.
Right. So we got to see where Mike Lee ends up. I do think this is an area where Pence will help. I do believe that there are a lot of RNC members who like Pence, a lot of House members who will be here, including Speaker Ryan, like Pence. So to the extent that they just need kind of a macro message of unity, I think that Pence's selection will help. And in Paul Manafort and the people Manafort have brought into this campaign, working hand in glove with Reince Priebus, you've got guys who understand, and they mostly are guys, how to control the Florida convention, how to try to game this out. But the fact that they had to break off and meet in private is not a great sign.
And blame it on the copier.
Blame it on the copier. It's still playing out. All right. This morning here in Cleveland, the party and the Trump campaign announced a partial list of the people who are going to speak here in Cleveland. Some we already knew, like Paul Ryan, Scott Walker, Ted Cruz, and members of Donald Trump's family. The roster, though, also has on it a cast of non-traditional characters, including some employees of Donald Trump, some people from big names from business, and some sports stars like the NFL quarterback Tim Tebow, the golfer Natalie Gulbis, the Ultimate Fighting Championship president Dana White. There's also an astronaut, a former underwear model or two. Al, does this roster, as varied as it is, suggest that they've got in place the building blocks to have a successful convention?
Mark, it's not as bad as it could have been.
Yeah.
We don't have any convicted rapists like Mike Tyson now speaking, so that's a
no
big
return of Clint Eastwood.
Exactly, although I love Dirty Harry, but you're right. But, you know, if it really had been what this party should be, it's to display the party. It should have had some of the interesting women new members. Elise Stefanik and Barbara Comstock and Mia Love, the most popular governors in America, John Kasich and Charlie Baker, really engaging young senators Marco Rubio and Jeff Flake. But there's a problem, Mark. None are going to be here. Well, John Kasich will be rolling around the streets, but not in the convention.
The Republican bench will largely not be on display, and it is, as you said, an impressive bench, a more diverse bench.
It is.
A broader bench with regional diversity than it's going to be in display with the main speakers. But this convention was always going to be about Trump and his family and people who he knows, and Trump knows how to put on a show. So there's some missed opportunities, and people who are, I've heard from today, who are heartbroken about what they believe Trump is doing to the brand of the party, look at this list and say, this is just the sort of the codification of Trump taking over the party and putting it in his brand, replacing the Republican brand, and therefore, by definition, not a very diverse brand.
No, I think that's right, and it would be interesting to see who he couldn't get. I mean, when his NFL star is Tim Tebow, I mean, Tim Tebow can't make the NFL.
Exactly.
I mean, that's not Tom Brady. Tim Tebow was really and never was. You know, it's okay. It's not going to. I don't think there's anybody probably who'll embarrass him. But it's not something you say, boy, is that impressive.
Not having Condoleezza Rice at the Republican convention, that alone is disappointing to a lot of people.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Clinton campaign has got a new TV ad out today. It's pretty negative, and it's getting rave reviews. It's called Role Model, highlights some of Donald Trump's more controversial statements, ones you'll be familiar with, while children watch with their mouths agape.
And you can tell them to go themselves. I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible. When Mexico sends its people, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
You know, you could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever.
You got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. Oh, I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember.
That ad is part of what we're told is an 8-figure buy that's going to air on cable TV in several battleground states. Democrats already praising the spot, say it's a powerful attack on the Republican nominee. And some Republicans we've heard from today feel that ad is also potentially pretty potent. Al, why is there so much buzz about this spot at a time when there's a lot of other news out there?
Mark, our Bloomberg poll in June, we asked the question, some issues Trump did well on. Who would do better about changing the way of Washington?
Right.
We asked 2 questions. Who'd be a good role model for your children? Clinton, 54-25. Who'd be a good guest in my home? Trump, 34, Clinton, 52. That's what they're playing to. This man will embarrass you.
Preying on his weakness.
Exactly. And the super PAC, not the Clinton campaign, tells me that the ads they have done on him mocking people with disabilities, which he plainly did, are among the most effective with viewers they've ever seen. This is a piece of that.
Helps with women, particularly suburban women, helps with independents. And I got to say, I believe that if a Republican used kids in an ad like that, it might face some criticism. I think that's a kind of maybe a questionable call to use kids like that. But it is a powerful ad. The juxtaposition is powerful. Later in the spot, they show Hillary Clinton speaking and kids listening to her. Right. And we all have intuition about when an ad is effective or not, even though we've not seen a focus group. But you can bet they focus group that. I think that ad and versions like it will run for a good long time. And Trump's going to figure out a way to rebut them.
He does, and he has problems because take again the disabilities issue. He will deny, as he did to the Washington Post, he was making fun of that reporter.
Right.
We all know that's a lie. Now, at some point, Donald Trump has to walk back some of the things he said and done, and he doesn't seem capable of that.
And this is where the Pence thing comes into play. You know, we've not seen the tableau of the Pence family with the Trump family standing side by side. Presumably, we'll see it tomorrow. I think Pence perhaps can remediate for Trump, perhaps. All right, coming up. You got more questions about Trump's new running mate? We're going to talk to a Trump senior advisor who knows Mike Pence, maybe better than she knows Donald Trump. Kellyanne Conway joins us right after this.
It has been an eventful day for the Republicans and their party. There was a Rules Committee meeting out in Cleveland, and of course, everyone, and I mean everyone, is talking about Donald Trump's looming Veep stakes decision. Joining us now to talk about both, Republican pollster and Trump campaign senior advisor, Kellyanne Conway, who joins us from New York. Kellyanne, I am looking at my Twitter, and it says there that a reporter by the name of Jonathan Karl is reporting that Donald Trump has offered the VP slot to Mike Pence. Is that true?
I cannot confirm that. What the campaign is saying, if you want to know who Donald Trump's VP is, then you have to show up at the Hilton or put a TV on around 11 a.m. tomorrow.
Okay, Kellyanne, I know you're someone who is very familiar with a lot of the people on Donald Trump's short list. Just give us the case for Mike Pence. Not saying that he is the pick, but what's the case for Pence? What does he bring to the ticket?
Sure. So the case for Mike Pence is a couple of things. He showed the other night at the rally that one can attack the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, challenge her fitness to be president, but to do it at 6 decibels, to do it surgically and methodically and yet passionately. The Rust Belt is very important. I think Mike Pence can do something like take a comment by Hillary Clinton that she made in West Virginia, promising to put the coal industry out of business and travel that comment westward through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa. Doesn't mean that you win all those states, but you sure make them competitive. He's also got a $2 billion surplus in Indiana, across-the-board tax relief for employers and for individuals, a large charter school expansion program, a lot of infrastructure development. The economy is going very well in Indiana, and he's created manufacturing jobs, which is something that Donald Trump has said he would like to do as president, and many people are skeptical about that. Like, oh, you can't create manufacturing jobs. In Indiana, under Governor Pence's leadership, they've done that. Pence also checks the Washington box. He spent 12 years in Congress. 10 of those were on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the last term in Congress before he successfully went home to run for governor, Mike Pence spent as the communications person in leadership for the Republican Party. He was on TV ubiquitously, the face of the party, has a great line, I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. I think the conservative movement, the Republican Party, particularly in a very negative election cycle, could really use more positive, uplifting, inspiring spokespeople.
Kellyanne, talk about Mike Pence's personality, which is underrated in terms of your sense of humor and kind of how outgoing he is. I think a lot of people who only view him casually through the national prism look at him as kind of a stiff, which he's not.
He's not a stiff. In fact, he's very funny. He had a radio show, which, as you both know, is very difficult in Indiana for many years. He referred to himself as Rush Limbaugh on decaf because he is a little bit more measured and laid back. Those of us on the East Coast can't always relate to someone, or at least I can't, to someone who is reflective and not reactive, who thinks about it. And I even think recently Mike Pence made a couple of comments about the state of the race that seemed to me much more measured and much more unique in their content and their cast than maybe what I think garden variety commentators were saying. Also, I think Mike Pence will help on the policy part. You know, Donald Trump is really moving into areas of policy. You saw the 10-point plan to reform the Veterans Administration this past Monday in Virginia Beach, very specific, concrete. I think he's someone who can help with that. He's also very well respected by members he served with in Washington. And also, I want to point out 2 quick things. One is, people missed this comment by Senator Jeff Flake in the Hill newspaper today, where Jeff Flake was very glowing about his friend and former colleague in the House, Mike Pence. Jeff Flake is the senator from Arizona last week who was pretty salty toward nominee Trump when he had his meeting in the Senate. Some people thought it was a bit disrespectful, but it definitely was confrontational. You get someone like Mike Pence on the ticket, and I think it's another window into getting the nominee, part of that party unity in all corners. Secondly, the donors and the consultants in the Never Trump movement are longtime friends and longtime supporters of Governor and Congressman Mike Pence. And so the question to them now is, this was the first major decision by the nominee in terms of personnel. What say you about someone you've worked with and you've trusted, Governor Pence, for a very long time?
So tell us a little bit. I'm continuing with my feature interview here because the country's going to have to get to know this guy, presumably starting tomorrow. Talk about the Pence family, Mrs. Pence and their children, and what kind of family they are.
Well, I love the Pence family. Karen Pence and Mike Pence have been married for about 31 years. They have 3 children. Michael, who's recently engaged and who serves this nation and is stationed in Florida. And Charlotte and Audrey, their 2 daughters. The Pences consider themselves, quote, empty nesters. The children are all in their mid to early 20s. And they're a very close family. They're a very tight-knit family. They make decisions together. I think it was reported that their one daughter was with them when they came out to Bedminster to meet the Trump family several weeks ago. And they also, I think the Trumps made a decision when their children were very small. I think their children were ages 4, 5, and 6 when he got to Congress, if I'm correct. And they made the decision to be together as a family in the Washington suburbs, to raise the children there so that they had dinner together every night. I think that's very sweet and very much who they are. They also are very active. I think Karen Pence, as First Lady of Indiana, has really kept a lot of her own schedule and been there. She's a very popular speaker, very popular personality and individual leader in Indiana. And I think as the country gets to know them, they'll very much enjoy them and like them. I think that's also why, as has been reported in many places, that the official vetting of Governor Pence was, fairly clean.
Kellyanne, there's been a lot of activity even besides the Veep Stakes drama today, or excitement today, in the Rules Committee out there in Cleveland. I know you're not there, but the campaign is obviously monitoring that pretty closely. It seems like efforts to forge some kind of a compromise there have kind of broken down. What can you tell us about what's going on in terms of getting something that will get you guys what you want and get a relatively peaceful convention?
As you say, John, those conversations are ongoing. That's precisely the function of the Rules Committee and the Platform Committee earlier in the week. I think these conversations are very healthy. The Democrats obviously had conversations like that last weekend in Orlando, where the Sanders people got an awful lot of what they wanted, and he certainly isn't even the nominee. So these conversations are healthy. I think there are some people who are part of the Never Trump movement and then the Free the Delegates movement and then the Pull My Hair Out movement who seem disappointed today because they feel betrayed that some folks may, in fact, actually be looking to make a difference for 2020 and not 2016. That's something else I wanted to say about Mike Pence to both of your questions. This is an everyman story, and I think my question, my party was veering dangerously close to becoming the party of the elites. And I appreciate the fact that Donald Trump has brought the Republican Party more toward the party of the worker through a lot of his plans and his ideas. And I think Trump-Pence ticket, hypothetically, again, since you're asking me about him, would sort of complete that in a way. Mike Pence has this, he grew up with a cornfield in his backyard, 6 children. His father died many years ago. His mother's the matriarch of the family. And I think people can relate to somebody who's not Ivy League educated, comes from a blue-collar background, has known what it's like to lose a job and wait for the next paycheck, something Mitt Romney tried to pretend he knew about a pink slip in 2012. Nobody believed it. Mike Pence has faced a pink slip. So I'm happy for my party, too, because I don't want the Republican Party to be the party of the elites in whom they nominate and what policies and who has influence in the party. And I think it's a really positive step forward, especially when it just seems at a time when Hillary Clinton's having a very difficult time gaining trust and also projecting herself as a person of the people.
Positive step forward if he's choosing Mike Pence.
If he's choosing, I want to say all hypothetically,
exactly.
Only one person makes that decision.
Exactly.
Donald J. Trump. You're asking me about one of the finalists.
You are like the Zelig of American politics. You're very close to Donald Trump, who you're now working for, very close to Mike Pence, and you're very close to Ted Cruz, whose super PACs you helped direct when he was a candidate. What's up with Ted Cruz here coming into Cleveland?
I'm thrilled that Senator Cruz is speaking at the convention. He'll have a lot to add. I'm glad that Mr. Trump asked him. I'm glad that Senator Cruz agreed to speak. That's really
why isn't he endorsed? Why isn't he endorsed yet?
Oh, I think everybody's so tired of the E word. What does that mean? I mean, he's going to the convention. Take it for what it is. I think that Senator Cruz will inspire lots of folks there who he came in second. He won the silver in a very tough year when so many odds were against, believe me, Trump and Cruz. They got the gold and the silver in a crowded, talented field of 17 people. So I think Senator Cruz being there is important. Governor Walker and certainly Governor Christie, others who are speaking, very positive step forward. I think so many conversations and reporting, Mark and John, have been about who's not going to be at the convention, but we're going to have to start forcing ourselves to really see who's going to be at the convention. A little bit unconventional convention, And I can tell you back at the headquarters, everybody's very excited, and those already on the ground in Cleveland, very excited about the convention that's coming together. And they're going to see a great deal of the same kind of enthusiasm and confidence and grassroots, bottom-up type of just vigor that we saw all through the primary system. That will continue into Cleveland. And I think in a place like Philadelphia, the Democratic Convention, Hillary Clinton runs the risk of being overshadowed by two presidents that are more popular than her, and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. This is Donald Trump's convention, and that's going to feel that way. And by the time you get the crescendo of him accepting the Republican nomination on Thursday, it's going to be, I think, record ratings. Can't wait to see you there.
Kellyanne Conway, the only person I know who could try to spin the presence of two former presidents who are quite popular into being a negative for the Democrats. It's always a pleasure to have you. That was fun.
It's a positive for the Democrats. It's negative for Hillary Clinton.
Thanks for coming on, Kellyanne. Up next, we'll talk to NBC's reporter on the Veep Stakes beat, Kelly O'Donnell, right after this.
I just saw Hamilton, a great musical. I saw it for the third time, if you don't tell anybody. And I hope you all listen to the soundtrack when it comes to Washington, and it's going to travel probably around the country for, the next century. But it tells us some important lessons. You look at our founders. Virginia gave us a bunch of them.
That was from this afternoon. Northern Virginia, John Heilemann there was covering Hillary Clinton's appearance with a man said to be one of her top, maybe her top VP contender, Senator from Virginia, former governor there, Tim Kaine. John's here with us now. I'm here in Cleveland, where we're talking about both the Republican Veep Stakes and the Democrats. We're going to start, though, with the Democrats and John at that event. So, John, I watched a little bit of on TV. The body language seemed to me to be okay. Not super, but okay.
Yeah, I thought, Mark, the best comparison right now, we've seen Hillary Clinton do this kind of audition thing that Donald Trump did with some of his potential picks. Now with Tim Kaine and with Elizabeth Warren. The Warren thing, I think the Warren event by most reckonings was pretty electrifying. This was not an electrifying event, but then Tim Kaine is not an electrifying guy. It was comfortable. They seemed very comfortable on stage with each other, but not on fire in any way. Again, that's sort of in keeping with Kaine's personality. He was, the way he is, which is to say, lighthearted, genial, congenial, a little Mr. Rogers-y on the stage. Not someone who's ever going to really light up a room and not someone who's going to make any part of the party go crazy. But as you know, from the Clinton perspective, some of those things are assets for Tim Kaine. He's obviously going to clear the ready-to-be commander-in-chief test, given his time as governor, mayor, and senator, and his foreign affairs experience. And also, he would be the clearest example you could imagine of a do-no-harm pick, someone who they would put on the ticket, they would get through the thing, and they could turn to what they really want to do, which is make this race about Donald Trump. No distractions.
Yeah. I mean, when people talk about these auditions, the reality is for the campaigns, there's no way to do this as a controlled experiment. To see what they're like in front of a crowd, you got to put them in front of a crowd. And I gather some relatively senior Clinton campaign officials came along today to watch the tires be kicked.
Yeah, I didn't see, I read and saw Jim Palmieri was there. There was a rumor that Podesta was around. I did not actually actually lay eyes on Podesta, but I think they were all checking it out. She's very familiar with Tim Kaine, right? This is not, in Trump's case, some of these people who he was auditioning to be his running mate are people he didn't know very well, even a couple months ago, like the person who's almost certainly going to be his selection, Mike Pence. Didn't really know these people. Tim Kaine and Hillary Clinton go back a pretty long way. So there's no surprises there and there's no revelations there. I think there's just more a taking of the temperature, and they're going to want to see how it looks on television. As I say, not an electrifying tableau, but one in which she seemed very happy to be there. He seemed very happy to be there. You could imagine them kind of fitting together in a relatively comfortable and friendly way going forward.
Okay, let's bring in our colleague Kelly O'Donnell of NBC News, who has been expertly covering the Republican Veep stakes and who knows Mike Pence from her time covering him on Capitol Hill. Kelly, you said something really important and smart this morning, or this afternoon, I guess, or actually was in the morning, about the Veep stakes and the fact that there's the first phase, which pretty much starts now, then goes through the end of the convention, and then there's everything else. And just talk about Pence as a first weeker, getting through the convention, basically, and the announcement in the convention, and then how you think he'll be after that and where his strength lies.
Well, first impressions matter in everything, including politics. And all the expectations are that a Mike Pence name on the ticket brings a certain sense of reassurance to some of the rest of conservatives who are uneasy about how Donald Trump would govern. Would he add a steadying force to the ticket? Would he be able to generate some of the donor interest that has been lagging because some of those big money donors who typically bankroll Republican candidates have been holding back, some directing their interest to Senate or House races instead? Can he speak to a part of the country that is not sort of on the surface Donald Trump-like? So in that first phase, that could be well received. Then the other challenge will be, how would a Mike Pence do under the white-hot spotlight of the day-in, day-out battle of this campaign? If Donald Trump, true to his form, and so far what we've seen this year is unpredictable, at times incendiary, and times provocative, will a Mike Pence, who is a much more controlled figure, will he be able to take that on every day? He'd be put to that test, and that would not be an easy thing for anyone on the ticket, and Mike Pence would be thrown into that as well. It is the kind of thing that takes us through different phases, from the initial kind of greeting, let's see the two-shot of the two candidates, to how would he go day to day, the vice presidential debate in October, how would he perform against a future Hillary Clinton partner, and then in governing if they were to win the election. And so there are definitely strengths at different points in the timeline for a Mike Pence, but perhaps not all of them.
Kelly, you've also done a lot of good reporting on what's been going on within the Trump high command, largely made up of his family, his kids, and his son-in-law. What's your sense of who was for Pence, who was against Pence?
Well, I think definitely from my reporting, I've been hearing that Melania and Ivanka pro-Pence, and Don Jr. pro-Gingrich, and I've also heard that there were Christie supporters in the group, And part of the dynamic that has emerged over the last few days is something that sources described as sort of a personal issue with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump, Ivanka's husband. They are so close to Donald Trump, so involved in his campaign. And for Jared Kushner, there's a hurdle that he has been resistant to overcome, and that is Governor Christie had been a prosecutor, U.S. attorney for New Jersey years ago, and Kushner's father, a Democratic philanthropist and donor, was prosecuted and sent to prison over tax evasion and some other charges. That is a big thing for a son to get past. And so that has been part of the resistance.
Without question. Kelly O'Donnell here in Cleveland, John Heilemann in Virginia. Thank you both. We're going to take a quick break, come back, tell you about some breaking news overseas right after this. Breaking news overseas at a time when the world is still braced for terror attacks in Nice, France. According to NBC News, a truck reportedly ran into a crowd there. The mayor of Nice said on Twitter that there appear to be dozens of deaths. According to the AP, I believe it's the AP, 10 reported, CNN is reporting the 10 dead now officially, but that is a big evolving story. Again, not clear that it's terrorism, but loss of life, and we'll continue to monitor that story for you. Also monitoring, Governor Pence reported earlier in the program he is reportedly on a private plane headed from Indiana to the New York area for what is expected to be an announcement tomorrow morning with Donald Trump in New York City at the Hilton Hotel, not at a Trump property, to join the ticket just a few days before the convention. So, John, this is late for Mike Pence and the Pence family. Obviously, they've known they've been under consideration for a bit, but there's a lot for him to do from the time he lands till next week, probably Wednesday, maybe Thursday, when he gives an acceptance speech here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll say a couple things. Just first of all, it's not very often when I can speak for millions of Americans, but I do believe it's fair to say that, you know, the idea of we've gone, I think, today, if you think about these, what we've seen today, the idea we had at one point, there was a possibility of either a Gingrich or a Christie debate with Elizabeth Warren to the more likely outcome now of a Mike Pence debate with Tim Kaine. I think everybody's probably a little disappointed about that. Mike Pence has got a lot to do here. You know, the two things you could say about Chris Christie and Newt Gingrich is that they have played on the national stage. Gingrich, obviously, for decades. Christie, more recently. Mike Pence is a serious person and has had a serious career, but he's never been in the spotlight in the way that he's about to be. And so he's got a lot of work to do to familiarize himself with a lot of issues and also to try to get himself ready for what is going to be really some very white-hot lights. He's never experienced anything close to this in his career so far.
Speech I saw him give the other day with Trump was a good template for what I suspect his convention speech will be like, and he did just fine. All right, stay with us. We'll be back to update you on all the latest news from here and around the world right after this. Breaking news, as we told you, the latest out of France is that at least 10 people are dead who were at a Bastille Day celebration in Nice, France. CNN reporting that the police there have exchanged gunfire. Not sure if that's terrorism or not. We'll stay on it here. Bloomberg will have all the latest news both here on TV and on the web. Coming up, Bloomberg West. We'll be back in New York tomorrow. John and I will be covering Donald Trump's announcement of his running mate, Mike Pence of Indiana. And then we'll have, with all due respect for you, wrapping up the full day in news, including more about what's going on here in Cleveland at the Platform Committee hearing. So for John and for me, thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Same bad time, same bad channel. Sayonara.